So we'll still wait a second for participants to come in. And I think we are good now. Also from my side, a very warm welcome to this joint webinar of the interest groups on international law and social science of the European and the American Society of International Law. So this time we have a really stellar panel, Tom Ginsburg and Jan Klabbers. And just, it came to my mind when I was preparing, I met both of them when I was doing my PhD. Tom at Berkeley, when he did his PhD in Berkeley, and Jan at a conference in Interlaken, Switzerland. That's quite a long time ago. So I'm very happy to welcome them both and to be able to join us here. Actually, both of them do not need an introduction. So I do a few words. Listing all of the merits would be too long. I start with Professor Tom Ginsburg. He's the Leo Spitz Distinguished Service Professor of International Law at the University of Chicago, where he serves as faculty director for the Forum on Free Inquiry and Expression, as well as the Mali Center for the Study of Institutional and Legal Integrity. He holds a BA, a JD, and PhD degrees from the University of California at Berkeley and currently co-directs the Comparative Constitutions Project, an NSF-funded data set cataloging the world's constitution since 1789 that runs the award-winning Constitute website. His latest books is Democracy and International Law, quite pertinent. And you all remember his article in the American Society on authoritarian international law. That book was also the winner of the best book prizes from the American branch of the International Law Association and the American Society of International Law. He's also the author of How to Save a Constitutional Democracy and many other books and articles. All of them actually show his instincts for important questions coming up. So I think his current research is also showing this, and I'm so happy you present your first results with us. He is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science, and I think I stop here. He has practiced with international law with the Iran-US Claims Tribunal in The Hague, and he consults with several agencies and governments on legal and constitutional reform. Let me turn to Jan Klabbers. Professor Klabbers recently switched to Cambridge as the Wewell Professor of International Law. And before that, he was Professor of International Law at the University of Helsinki, where he has been based since 1996, having previously taught also at the University of Amsterdam. Professor Klabbers served for 20 years as the Deputy Director of the Erik Castren Institute of International Law and Human Rights, and from 2006 to 2011 as Director of the Academy of Finland Center of Excellence in Global Governance Research. And I think from this also stems all this interest on international organizations. He has served on the Executive Council of the European Society of International Law and received numerous teaching awards at the University of Helsinki, and he's also a member of the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters. He was editor-in-chief of the Finnish Yearbook of International Law and has been co-editor of the Nordic Journal of International Law since quite a long time. Many other things coming up here, but I think what's most important is that Professor Klabbers is widely regarded as one of the world's leading experts in the law of treaties and, more relevant for here, the law of international organizations. And those who have an interest in international organizations will not get around his book, An Introduction to International Organizations with Cambridge University Press, in its 4th edition by now. He's currently leading a research project funded by the European Research Council on relations between intergovernmental organizations and the private sector. So I stop here with the introductions. Tom will speak for about 20 minutes and Jan will comment for about 10 to 15 minutes, after which we will open the discussion. And I would like to ask you to put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. And with this, I stop. And Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Looking forward.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. And very honored to have Jan here, who really is the leading scholar in international organization law. It's a field that's rather new to me. But I'm coming at it from a different perspective in some sense because I'm coming at it through the study of national constitutions, with which, of course, international organizations do share some qualities, right? That they're both um, governance structures that are designed to endure over time. They're attempts to create public goods together. And of course, they have to deal with change. And that's really the topic of my talk today. Now, let me try to share my screen with the appropriate, let's see, there we go. All right. And one moment. One second. Yeah, there it worked. Okay, good. So this is a project I'm doing with Kristina Daugirdas, and it's an attempt to look at the charters of intergovernmental organizations through the perspective of constitutions, I suppose you could say, looking at them as founding texts. Of course, we know, just as with national constitutions, the things in charters are just one part of the governance structure, but they're particularly important because, of course, in international law, international organizations get their personality from from charters. Indeed, they're definitional. What we're doing is we put together a database. We're trying to get every charter that we can find. The universe of international organizations, though, is not well understood in my view. There's a very famous data set by the Correlates of War, which once we delved into, we thought, well, actually, many of the things that they had were not really international organizations. Some of the things in there were some international organizations that were not in their data set. Indeed, I was in Morocco a couple months ago, and I was just walking down the street of Rabat, and I walked by this thing which I'd never heard of, which was an international organization, not in their data, not in anyone else's data. So they're hard to find, unlike national constitutional texts, which are major events in the life of the nation. So our data is clearly incomplete, but let me just describe it. First of all, we define international organizations for our purposes, for our data purposes, as of course being governed by international law, having more than two members. And that, of course, is not consistent with the legal definition, but it's consistent with all prior empirical exercises in studying international organizations. It has to have the institutional structure of some kind, distinct will, as the lawyers call it. And so defined, the typical or modal charter is a treaty. But of course, not all IOs are set up by treaty. You have things like the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and emanations from other international organizations. So we're not strict about that, but we do take some foundational text as critical for us. Of course, international organization scholars are familiar with the idea that they all have kind of a fairly typical structure. That is a plenary body of all members, a smaller governing body with maybe a more elite or more important set of members, maybe that would rotate, and some kind of secretariat, which is, of course, very important and maybe close to definitional in terms of having organs for purposes of operations. Now, what we did is we started with this correlates of war data set and then cleaned it up, removing some, adding some other observations. We also looked at any organization that was an observer at the United Nations, and if it met our definition, we added it. We looked at a couple of other projects. There's one by Volgi. So we've kind of always been supplementing our sample, dropping things and adding them. We restrict the analysis to those that were alive after 1945. So there's a sort of historical set of IOs that we just didn't get into, mostly because the era of international organization is really 1945 onward. But we do include those that, like the International Labor Organization, that start beforehand. Comparing our data with others, this chart's a little bit out of date. We call this the Charters of Intergovernmental Organizations Project, CIGO. And you can see that our sample is larger than other empirical efforts to study intergovernmental organization. Hucha, I think she's a Belgian scholar, and Gary Marks and others worked together to do a series of books on internet governmental organizations. Um, Compared with those in the UN system or HUHA, our sample includes smaller IO. So part of our effort is to see, what is typical. There's so much work, and I think Jan has written about this. The European Union is so central in people's conception of an IO. So is the United Nations. Those are very atypical, it turns out, and we wanted to provide a richer empirical basis. The average IO in our sample is smaller, is less democratic, is more recent, and the charter is less articulated, has fewer words and maybe less structure. This shows the wave of our sample of the creation of these charters. And probably there continue to be IOs that are created, but it's possible that the era of formal intergovernmental organization is declining as more public-private partnerships, looser forms are coming into being. We don't make an assertion about that, but this just shows you that in our sample, there's sort of big spikes in intergovernmental organization around the end of World War II, the early 70s, and then, of course, the end of the Cold War. This shows that they get longer over time in terms of the number of words. And again, that the number of members, the modal number of members, is something like 8. It's very small. Whereas, again, our conception of IOs tends to focus on larger ones. Okay, so much for the data. Oh, 2 other things. Where are they? Africa is very densely networked region for intergovernmental organizations. And one of the things I've been doing when I go around my travels for various other things, I show up at intergovernmental organizations and just see who's working there and what they're like. It's been very interesting because some are very, very elaborate. Some are basically like 3 people in a Xerox machine in a rundown building. So it's extremely diverse group. But Africa is the largest, is the place with the most intergovernmental organizations, followed by Europe, the orange slice there. Asia is relatively uninstitutionalized in this way, but the Arab world and the Caribbean, for the number of countries, actually pretty densely organized, and that's interesting to us. And then in terms of topics that they focus on, we develop some categories. The blue in the upper right is economic and financial cooperation. No surprise there, but that's a public good that states cooperate on to create bigger markets and such. There's quite a number on resources, which is things like commodity organizations, or we would include environmental organizations there too. That's the orange category. So that's another variable which we can use to analyze, or it's another predictor, I suppose, of difference in form across intergovernmental organizations, and we have some work that's exploring that as well. Let me just go right ahead to the more interesting thing for our topic, amendment. When we think of a national constitution, we think of parties getting together to negotiate a deal that is meant to endure over time. But of course, they understand that there will be change and that the world is going to change, that they might not be able to predict the future accurately. And so the way we think about this in constitutional terms is that you have a sort of a contract among parties that will be stable as long as there's not what we call exogenous shock, some kind of thing to change the underlying assumptions. And when there is, then you would expect that there would be a need to change the founding document. However, if it's really too easy to change, then it doesn't do any good in terms of governing stably across time. And it's also the case that negotiating a new change, the transaction costs of revising are positive. It's always going to be costly to renegotiate the deal. And so there's kind of a calculus that comes up when a change occurs, when a change in the world occurs. Do we change the governance structure? And of course, the easier it is, the lower the amendment threshold in terms of the supermajority required, the easier it will be to make changes. If the parties think, on the other hand, that they don't want to change things, they really want to lock themselves in, then you might have a unanimity rule, making it very hard to change. And there's a whole field of what's called constitutional economics, very interesting here. Just as with national constitutions, there's informal change as a substitute. So, for example, in the United States, and that could be various things. That could just be a different understanding. It could be revision through reinterpretation of the founding document, or sometimes what we sub-constitutional instruments. So, for example, in the United States, we have some statutes that are considered almost constitutional in the sense that they would never be changed, or at least this was the understanding before Donald Trump, who's running over a few of those. But the idea that you could, if you couldn't get together a formal amendment, you could change things informally or using lower level legal instruments. That seems quite plausible. So this is the basic framework we start with, but we do note that there's some disanalogies. So a constitution is an ongoing governance arrangement for a polity that will endure forever. And it covers every possible topic that is going to come up in that governance arrangement. Whereas international organizations, of course, are much thinner. Even with the exception of the European Union, I guess we'd say that they tend to be very specific public goods that are created by these charters. And so that might mean that the stakes of, that the costs of having something be too rigid would not be that high. In other words, if we're cooperating on, I don't know, intergovernmental flight arrangement or something like that, or, the seagull protection in a border, it's just not that high stakes. And to me, that means that you could thus not be worried about negotiation problems that would arise if you needed to change, holdout problems. You could simply allow a unanimity rule. The other disanalogy is that, of course, countries leave IOs, and states generally cannot leave constitutional arrangements. Individuals have trouble. And so exit is really important in that sense. And that means that one way to think about this is a classic framework. Exit is a substitute for voice. If you need to incentivize people to participate in governance, then, if you don't have exit, you need to incentivize people to participate in governance. And you might want an easier amendment rule. Whereas, if it's a unanimity rule and I'm unhappy with it, I can just leave. So it's not a big cost to have a unanimity rule. Now, the question we set out to answer in this paper is, does the rule matter at all? And I've written a paper on this in the constitutional area and found very mixed evidence, actually. In other words, what does that mean? A higher threshold for constitutional amendment does not necessarily lead to more amendments. The evidence is rather mixed, and countries vary in this regard. I won't go into that literature, but it's not clear that the rule matters. And so we wanted to explore that here with IO charters. And we've sort of been thinking about what kinds of things would lead and here's the key variable we're interested in is there a unanimity rule, which of course is the classic position in treaty law and with international law generally, that no state can be bound without its consent to anything? Or is there some sort of supermajority rule or majority rule for parts of governance? That's our key question. And in general, in these charters, we found a lot of supermajority rules about lots of topics, the budget and things like that. That's what allows intergovernmental organizations to operate. But amendment specifically, it's not clear that states would agree in advance to have a supermajority rule to amend the charter, because that could mean they would be bound rather easily without their consent. Just to foreshadow, in our data, about half of the IOs we've looked at have unanimity rules for amendment, and about half have some sort of supermajority. So the key question we're asking is, does that make a difference for amendment frequency and other variables of interest? Why would you put in a rigid rule, a unanimity rule? Well, first of all, if you're really, if you're really convinced that you know what's going on, and you don't think the world is going to change very much, then you don't really need to contemplate changing a lower threshold. Also, if you mistrust the other parties, right? If you think you're going to be in a minority and a majority voting situation, then you probably would want a rigid rule. Um, the number of parties we predict actually is going to lead to number of parties goes up, we predict you're going to get more supermajority rules and less unanimity. And the reason is if just mechanically, if you have a IO with three parties and they want to change things, you only have to negotiate with three parties. If you have one with 20, and each one has a veto, it's going to be much more hard to change. That's the intuition there. And so if you're in advance writing it down such a governance arrangement, you'd want to have a less than a unanimity rule. In addition, we do think stakes matters a little bit. So I don't know. I mean, I guess it would be that if it's a security issue or something like that, well, then states are really not going to want to be bound by their consent. They might not want to use the exit option either in that case. Whereas if it's I don't know, something very minor, then maybe they would not worry too much about being outvoted in an amendment process. Um, what else? I think I'll skip that point. We're not sure about democracy. So, like, you could imagine that democracies would be more jealous of guarding their sovereignty. But on the other hand, we know from a bunch of literature that democracies tend to be the ones that cooperate with each other to produce, you know, well-run international organizations. And if you want to have a well-run international organization producing a public good at the international level, you probably need a supermajority rule rather than a unanimity rule. And so there's kind of competing predictions there. All right. This shows you of our variable of interest that basically it's pretty stable. That is, supermajority rules about half of IOs, and the other half would be unanimity or consensus. We lump those two things together. And, the supermajority rules are about half throughout the period we study. All right, now I'm going to get into some regression, so I apologize here. And maybe what I'll do is I'll stop sharing. Well, I don't know. I don't know if everyone likes to look at the numbers, but I'll do it. All right, so what do we find? First thing we ask is what predicts having a supermajority rule? And it turns out that the more democracies you have, the more likely that you're going to have a unanimity rule. That's what this shows us. As the number of members goes up, you're more likely to have a supermajority rule. We also look at whether or not the secretariat is been given a lot of independence by the charter. And it turns out when you have a relatively independent charter, you're 5% more likely, 6% more likely to have a supermajority rule. That is, one way to think about that is unanimity goes together with relatively weak secretariats. Supermajority rules go together with strong secretariats. So that's probably more effective governance arrangements, but ones in which the states lose quite a bit of power. I don't want to go through every single result here. I think but I will say that we do find that the lower 4 or 5 rows look at the type of cooperation, the issue you're cooperating on. And when you're working on economic cooperation, or certainly like natural resources, or even any kind of technical thing like, I don't know, intellectual property or something like that, you have much easier amendment rules. You're more likely to have a supermajority rule. If it's security, you're less likely to. So that's that point about stakes. Good. Now, how much do these rules predict amendments? And there we have to have a kind of some sort of model about what predicts demand for amendments over time. And here we look at several other characteristics. More technical organizations, you might think, would require more amendment. Things like commodities organizations where they're setting prices and stuff like that, or where technology is changing, you might have a more need to change things over time. We also, again, focus on the autonomy of the Secretariat. So, and the idea there is that if you have an agent, an autonomous and powerful Secretariat, they need the IO to keep functioning. They want it to keep functioning, and they will identify changes and also, help the states negotiate to make the change. We also include an analysis of how long has it been since the last amendment. Here, the idea is that every amendment brings the thing a little more up to date. And so as you get more time, more years between an amendment, after an amendment, the more likely you would need to change it. And we also think membership changes matter, and that as states come in and out, that will lead to amendment. By the way, there are some IOs for which the list of members is actually in the charter. And so an amendment, every time you change membership, you have to change the charter. That's not that common, although Jan might tell me otherwise. But even so, even in other kinds of IOs, membership changes tend to lead to amendment. Also, whether or not there's an authoritative interpreter, by which we mean a court or something like that, that can interpret the founding text so that you don't need formal change. You can use that mechanism of informal change. And I don't think I'll say much about that. This shows you the amendment rate, the probability of an amendment in any given year, about 3 to 4%, higher in some areas, lower in others. And when we looked again, and this regression is, again, a little hard to read, but it shows that some of the factors we predict will make a difference. I see that the indicators of statistical significance aren't here, but the type matters a lot. So again, you have less amendment in the economic area, less in security, older. With membership change does seem to correlate or predict, and an independent secretariat again does. Now, third question, and then I'll turn it over to others. What makes international organizations resilient? There's a number of excellent papers on this by political scientists and some international lawyers. And my thought is this, and it comes from my work on national constitutions, is that net of everything else, an amendment would predict survival. That is, as you have an arrangement, something changes. If you can't adjust the governance rules, then states might just say, well, we're not participating anymore. We're going to kill that IO or let it die on the vine. And that would mean that amendments should predict survival. And this is true with national constitutions. Flexibility of amendment rule and amendments predict vitality. So what other factors? There's some literature already out there. And so, and we look at some things like larger IOs would be more resilient. The thought here is that, if a couple members are really upset with the IO and they leave, if you have 30 members, that's not a big deal. But if you have 3, it is a big deal, and the IO will die. More diversified funding sources. Again, we're not sure about how democracies would act here, but that's our prediction. And again, we ran a survival model. This is fairly preliminary, but we show that having a lower amendment threshold leads to longer lived IOs. It predicts more endurance. Larger IOs in terms of number of members. Some of the other variables in Model 2, the years since the last event, in other words, since the last amendment, that actually predicts death. In other words, you're more likely to die if you have if the longer it's been since your last amendment. So that again cuts in the same direction. Membership changes are associated with death. at a very small level. So more membership withdrawals or additions, the more the membership's changing, the more likely you are to die, which is rather interesting. Okay, bottom line, just to summarize, rules do seem to matter. In other words, these regressions, what we're doing is we're controlling for lots of other factors and asking what the rule is and whether it makes a difference. And again, unlike national constitutions, the easier IO charters are to amend, the more likely they are to be amended. That's the fundamental first finding. In terms of the variables that predict these things, the more members, the larger the IO means you're less likely to have a rigid amendment rule in the first place. You're more likely to have an amendment net of the other factors and to survive, even though, as I just said on the last slide, membership change hurts endurance. Independent secretariats turn out to be very important. I don't think that's a surprise probably to IO scholars, but we have a way of measuring it, that they predict more flexible rules and more amendment events. And the democracy finding is mixed, but we do find that it leads to more rigid rules. Democracies are more jealously guarding of their sovereignty, even controlling for other factors. So that's basically, I think that's the, yeah. And then we have all kinds of other things we do with this data. I don't want to talk about that yet. But it's a preliminary paper and a preliminary project. So I'm very much looking forward to Jan's corrections and such, and also, of course, to comments and questions from the floor. Jan, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tom. This is fascinating stuff. I have very little to correct. I will do some, well, correction is a big word. I will raise a few points about the paper as such towards the end. But since I'm a fish out of this particular water, not the IO water, but the approach, the methodology water, I thought I better not even try to swim there. Regressions make me very nervous. So I thought maybe I should complement a bit. But I find this very interesting, very plausible, and I have long argued, both privately and probably also publicly, that we should pay a lot more attention to amendment and change in international organizations. I've been telling prospective PhD students that there would be an excellent topic there. No one has picked it up yet, which tells you something about my salesmanship, but that's for something else. I thought this was wonderful stuff, and the point about bargaining in the shadow of the law is, of course, a classic of legal sociology. Stuart Macaulay already in the 60s with respect to contract law. So I buy pretty much everything you say. I do have a few points, but I thought I'd start by maybe making some complementary remarks, going from the large numbers that you guys use to something a bit more granular, to some of the techniques that are used for change in international organizations, additional to and perhaps beyond amendment. Of course, one fairly obvious technique is to give the organization a lot of different functions and powers to begin with. And the textbook case here is the WHO Constitution, the World Health Organization's Constitution, which gives the organization no less than 22 different powers in Article 2 of its constitution. That's pretty rich, pretty detailed, and pretty open-ended. Number 22 of those is to take all necessary action to obtain the objective of the organization. So there's not a lot that doesn't get covered, potentially at least. Then, as every international organizations lawyer knows, and every IR scholar doing international organizations law should know, there's the implied powers doctrine, precisely to massage, if you will, this particular topic. There is informal amendment, NATO in the early 90s being the classic textbook example, at least in my textbook. There's a very interesting technique used in the 90s of grafting on top of something else. Think of the WTO being built on top of the existing GATT, around the existing GATT. Think of the EU being built not from the scratch, but on the basis of the existing communities. Traditionally, there have been the chain conventions, the Postal Union, the Telecom Union, replacing the Constitution every now and then rather than amending it, just as if you would start all over again. There is from the WTO familiar the plurilateral technique, so allowing states to join individual bits and pieces. That would not work with very constitutional provisions, perhaps, but it does play a role. Something similar in the sense that it might not work for constitutions, perhaps you see in some environmental regimes where change can be accommodated through the adjustment of annexes by majority rather than going back to the original document. The ozone layer regime is a classic. I heard yesterday, I haven't had the occasion to check, but I heard yesterday that something similar might apply in ICAO, the Civil Aviation Organization. Very curious, there are sometimes quasi-reservations to constitutions, pioneered by France already in 1874, when the Postal Convention was concluded, and France ratified by saying, we make a reservation on two things. One is voting requirements when it comes to changing postal rates, and the other is the entry into force for us. And everyone seemed to accept that. The US did something similar when joining the World Health Organization, adopting in the Act of Approval. Congress said, if we want to get out, we get out. There's no withdrawal clause in the World Health Organization Constitution. But everyone seems to have accepted that the US can do that. That's something I'll get back to. If you can't change from within, you change from without. You operate flanking creatures. Again, the World Health sphere is typical, perhaps, or sets the tone where the World Health Organization has come to be accompanied by the Global Fund, by the Gavi Alliance, and a bunch of other entities that work in the field of global health and do things that the World Health Organization itself might find more difficult to do. So instead of amending that, you go around. And then again, World Health, there are secondary instruments being used. The very interesting international health regulations add considerable powers to the Director General of the WHO in a way that did not require constitutional amendment. And I'm guessing, like occasionally I speak to people who are legal counsel at international organizations, at a whole variety of them, and they tend to be pretty reluctant to engage in constitutional amendment. It's a lot of work, obviously. It turns the whole place upside down, and success is not always guaranteed. There are other techniques to accomplish change, a bit more drastic, a bit more robust, perhaps, or a bit more dramatic. Think of the US withdrawing in 1977 from the ILO and returning 3 years later, once the ILO had adopted its tune to the US policy preferences. Think of playing around with contributions that the person in the White House is currently experimenting with, much to the chagrin of the whole city of Geneva. And even the ousting of a director general has happened in the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons as a way to get change accomplished. This is not constitutional amendment, of course, but to accomplish change. Or the refusal to reappoint Boutros Ghali in the 1990s. There are counter techniques available. One of those is to insist that the organization will be, shall be, should be member state driven. You see that in the World Trade Organization. Whether it has been a good idea is a different story. It's probably related to its current paralysis and crisis, but nonetheless, insist it's member state driven. You see the same in the, so it's a more recent way of doing it, I guess, in the International Renewable Energies Agency, which also says no new obligations shall be created for member states, regardless of what the organization otherwise is empowered to do. And then there's, of course, the explicit withdrawal clause going from Article 1 of the League of Nations Covenant, which was always, Article 1, come on, it's like getting married with the divorce papers already in your inside pocket. Or more recently, Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union. Or then one can also think, to prevent change, the counter technique of setting up an organization for a definite period of time. The coal and steel community in Europe was an example. The wonderful ITER, which stands for International Thermonuclear Energy Reactor, which is a small research-based organization in the south of France, is set up for 35 years. And then finito. At least that's the general idea. There's a possibility for renewal, but even that's limited in time. Now, I promised a few words, so mindful of the time, on the paper itself. One of them you addressed while speaking, because I was a bit uncertain what you would mean by the provision of public goods. The paper seems to assume very strongly that international organizations are set up to provide public goods. And then you explained, and I quote, to create markets and such, which you and I might agree is a public good, but it's not only a public good. There's also a lot of self-interest at stake there. Not so much of states, but of their constituencies, the private companies that push a few buttons here and there. So when I think of public good, I think of public health or that sort of thing. Be less inclined to immediately associate the creation of markets with public good, but I would also acknowledge that can be done. And that has my particular interest at the moment. Anna explained when introducing me that I'm working on international organizations and the private sector. And that's precisely the angle that most organizations are set up or work towards facilitating the global marketplace. A further comment, there is also in the paper a hint or two at the benefits of joining or withdrawing. Those hints, but maybe I read too much between the lines there, seem to be mostly about tangible benefits, that you get something out of joining. But in some cases, there might also be intangibles. The collective recognition offered by the UN is the textbook example, I guess, ever since John Daugirdas wrote his book in the 80s. Being admitted to the UN has great value above and beyond whatever material benefits might flow, because that means you're accepted as a member in good standing in the international community. Something related, sometimes states might wish to mark their sovereignty, their newfound sovereignty, by joining an international organization, not so much the UN, but also regional ones. The point has been made 20 years ago by Amitav Acharya and what's the name, Johnston, in a book. The idea being that in Africa and in Asia in particular, but maybe mostly Africa and the Arab world, states would join organizations not so much because they expected to get much out of it per se, but because that meant they were states. That meant that they could say, hey, we are sovereign, and that then would feed back into domestic policies. And by the same token, states might wish to join in order to lock in domestic prerogatives, domestic policy preferences, to make sure that the next government cannot undo their good work. But the one thing that struck me most, perhaps, and that's something I would invite you to reflect upon. I have no answer to this, but it did cross my mind that often when you talk about change in international organizations, it tends to be driven by a hegemonic power. The last century or so, the US, in the 1920s, perhaps Britain's attempt to get Liberia expelled from the League of Nations over whatever flimsy argumentation there was. I would wonder what the numbers would look like. And I don't know if that can be done technically, but if you would take the US out of the equation, like is there a hegemonic bias in the sort of work? That point makes sense? So, yeah, fascinating paper, offers a lot of food for thought. It inspired me to go back to some of the books and look for examples of those techniques and stuff. So thank you very much for doing this and for enriching the field. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Thanks so much to Tom and Jan. I think that really was already a tour de force. And it seems in a way, I see no questions for the moment, which allows me to misuse my position and ask you some questions, Tom. And I think Jan already hinted at a lot of different ways where you could go and look at. So one question, and that clearly is also where Jan is going. I think you should be collaborating on that maybe. So what you looked at are only international organizations, so states being the members. But what we know, since the orchestration article, that we have all sorts of, NGO, international organizations, business, more or less, it could be business NGO, or it could be all sorts of combinations, but many things are going on in international governance which are not state confined. So I wonder whether it's a possibility to extend your data set on those, because there are so many. I think it would give you enough N to see whether they are set up in a very different way. And whether they have amendment rules and in what ways their charters differ. That's one question. The other one, you had this big thing which was called other, right? And then you looked at democracy. And I suppose the human rights organizations are, think Council of Europe, but also the Organization of American States and which have a court. Is in this other thing. And I was wondering whether you find specifics for human rights organizations and whether this is not like a variable which could maybe influence what you find for democracy. So I wonder whether you disentangled that or not. Then the third question is, I wondered whether you took the data set of Barbara Corremenos, on which she did on the continent of international law, to check with this sort of design of treaties and international organizations, if they set one up. And the fourth one is, and that comes a little bit back to the suggestion Jan had concerning taking the US out. I would put it more generally. I think about international organizations in a way as a club. Usually clubs have some sort of mechanism to make obstructive members exit. Not all international organizations have that. But when I think about dying international organizations, one big member, one big important member obstructing the organization can make the organization die. Think NATO, think WTO. So, we might be better off from, the perspective of the survival of an international organization to have explicit mechanisms to put them out. The COE has this with Russia and has done it with Russia, but usually what we find is only we take away their voting rights. And I wonder whether this is sufficient to make, for example, amendment possible, or you might even not even want an amendment. I stop here because now I have 2 questions and 3 now, and I would like to gather them. You have seen them as well, Tom and Jan.
Oh.
Otherwise, I quickly read them. So
No,
Hannah Birken, yeah, can you read them?
Yeah, I can see them.
Okay.
Maybe what I could do is I could answer the questions you've asked and then answer those as best I can.
Or since I just misused my position, answer the questions of the participants first, and then if you still have time, answer mine.
Okay, but I want to make a point. I want to respond to a point of Jan's, which is very important because it's this is law and social sciences. We have some probably young social scientists on the call. So what I mean by public goods is kind of a classic economic take on this. It's not a normative thing that some things are good if they're public and they're bad if they're private. It's basically states cooperating together to do things that they can't do, or they could do better on an international level than they could do at the national level, like a security cooperation arrangement is one where two states cooperate. Now they have a bigger defense force, if you will. So that's the idea. But Jan's point about private participation is very important. And Anna made the point too, that we now have these organizations. One of the phenomena we've observed is that even for classic international organizations, you now have private associate memberships or observers. And so there's a private organization or private actors, companies and such, are participating in public international law organizations. And I find that interesting because that suggests, to Jan's question, maybe this isn't all public interest. Maybe there's some capture, if you will, that's going on. And that's definitely something that's worth looking at. We code actually whether or not private organizations can join. It's one of our variables. Let me see about, and the hegemon point, which both Anna and Jan made, is also very important. We look at that. So, for example, let's say we look at that by looking at something called an indicator of national capabilities that looks at GDP and size of the population. Some countries are bigger and thus have more weight informally in any negotiation. And we actually measure that. We do find that countries with a stronger large power tend to have are less likely to have a supermajority rule. And that makes some sense because if you think about it, if you're the large power, you want the veto. You don't want to be outvoted by a lot of little states and such. And so that's another thing we're looking at systematically. Looking at the questions that have been asked, Hannah's question, regional distributions that account for population size. It's a good question. I think I did look at this at one point. I don't have the number here. I think relative to population size, the Caribbean is the most densely networked region because, of course, it's very small countries altogether. But the question is whether or not, when I was looking at the regions with the most IOs, was that controlling for a number of countries? I could control for a number of countries or a number of people. And I initially looked like some of the smaller regions, the Arab world and the Caribbean, were most dense in that regard. But the real point in that figure is that Asia is obviously the world's largest region in population, very under-institutionalized relative to the rest of the world. And that's something I wrote on many years ago in a paper called Eastphalia. I have the numbers on how many IOs have courts. I don't have them at my fingertips, and because of the bad internet where I am, I can't check right now, but I do have that, Hannah, and I can write to you later about it. It's larger than you think. And because many of the IOs are not setting up their own courts, but they are relying on an authoritative interpreter. So, for example, if the charter says, disputes about this will be resolved by the ICJ, that counts as a court or an authoritative interpreter in our data. The anonymous attendee asks, could we talk a little bit more about reinterpretation? And that is more Jan's. I'm going to leave that for Jan because he's the expert in that. And the final question before I turn it to him, are there regional differences regarding what kind of informal changes are implemented? And how might that matter in ensuring longevity? That's a great question by my former UChicago student, Aya, I think. And I'm going to turn that over to Jan too. In other words, are there regional differences in your experience, Jan, with regard to informal changes that you so well laid out in your comment?
Putting me on the spot, are you?
Well, or do we know anything?
No.
Let me just say one thing before I do that. One thing I do think is that different IOs develop different cultures of amendment. So like UNESCO amends their charter a lot. And I think there's some very local kind of demand, but I wonder if it's regionally correlated. I probably could produce some data on that. But Jan, I don't know if you have any knowledge about it.
I don't have any deeper insights on that, no. Partly because I know way too little about stuff that goes on outside Europe. I've had occasion to look a little bit within Europe. But I know very little of what goes on in the Pacific or Asia or Africa or Latin America for that matter. snippets here and there. So I couldn't do that justice, that question. The question on reinterpretation, I think that happens that's probably ubiquitous, that terms change, words change, their meanings change, conceptions about what they're supposed to achieve change. I would think in that sense that change is an everyday occurrence. That's maybe too strong, but probably an every week occurrence, and that many potential amendments are being taken care of by informal reinterpretations. That's a conclusion that Ralph Zeklin already reached in 1967 in his PhD on amendment of the specialized agency constitutions. That much of the action was really informal, and informal then meaning really through reinterpretation here and there. Even in the absence of courts, I'm not sure, like there are very few organizations that have their own courts. So I think we can agree on that. And the EU is again an outlier, the ICJ, the UN is an outlier. And then you have the WTO, but that doesn't have any constitutional authority. The WTO panel is an appellate body. The Council of Europe has the European Court of Human Rights, but that does not say anything about the Council of Europe per se. So there are very few courts, organizations with their own courts. I think Tom is right in suggesting that it's always possible for them to activate the ICJ or some other instance, but that happens pretty rarely. ICAO now, the Civil Aviation Organization, has been confronted with a couple of appeals on decisions of its council, but that's about it. In earlier days, there was at least a possibility, or at least regrettably perhaps, the possibility to appeal. An organization could appeal to decisions of administrative tribunals, but that has pretty much been abolished too. So UNESCO and other organizations no longer enter the ICJ through that route.
Great.
So
Jan, I'm afraid I need to cut you short because we have 1 hour exactly, unfortunately. I'm so sorry for that. But I hope that also some of the 2 more questions which were in the Q&A were at least partially answered by Dana Burkhardt and Naida Softik. By what you have said. Again, I would like to express my deep gratitude for you both for joining, especially to Tom, because it's Thanksgiving coming up soon. He has traveled. He's in California. It's really early for him. So many thanks for joining us, nevertheless. And I would like to make just announce the new the upcoming webinars. The next speaker in our series will be Guillermo Garcia Sanchez, speaking on the topic of the other secret deals, uncovering the power of non-binding international agreements, which will take place on the 10th of December, I think. And Tim Meyer of Duke will be commenting, and Chen Yu of Hong Kong University will be moderating the session. And there is also on the 29th of January, a talk by Anna Spain-Bradley, Anna Saab, commenting on the topic of judicial emotion at the International Court of Justice. So I hope that you will all join us there as well. And thanks for the audience. Thanks for the question. And now I wish everyone a wonderful evening, day, or night for wherever you are. And thanks again to all, including